I really want folks to participate and think of this as a conversation. So if you have questions throughout, I think that you can leave questions in the chat box. Hopefully our friendly moderator folks are on that. There are also a few times in here that I will ask for responses specifically, including in our very first slide. So let's get started. All right, so how many of you have family, loved ones, coworkers, friends who are Black, Latino, Latinx, Indigenous, Asian, Native Hawaiian, or Pacific Islander? I just want to know. So put a 1 in the chat box if you identify with this or are yourself one of these categories.
And so far, I see nothing but 1s coming in.
All 1s. All right. So that is what I expected. We are a very diverse society, population, world, and especially now with people working remotely. I know a lot of folks who are now working with people in different countries more than they did previously, maybe doing speaking engagements. Today, actually, I don't know if it's today anymore. It's 1 o'clock, so it's 6 o'clock there. Today in London, there's a digital mental health conference that several people I know are attending. And so there's a lot going on, right, in the world of mental health. So let's keep that in mind. So why did I ask you this? So I asked you this because the first step in getting anything done in making any change is investment. People have to be invested. And so it's really easy for us to be invested in mental health sort of in a sort of vague way. But when you think about specifically, you know, the mental health of the people I work with, the mental health of the people I love, the mental health of the people in my family, both my biological family and my chosen family, it suddenly becomes a lot more important, right? And people are really more motivated to take active steps. And so that is what we need because we are experiencing a global mental health, I don't want to call it a crisis, but it kind of is one. And especially post-pandemic world, people being isolated, people having to grieve and work and worry about money at the same time. All of that has hit everyone's mental health very hard. There are a lot of observational and anecdata around this. People are interacting differently in public in a lot of ways that maybe are not the most productive. There are some driving patterns that have emerged, right? I don't know if you've noticed that people are driving a little bit more recklessly. I've talked about that with people. There are some lower patience and lower tolerance in like customer service and customer facing worlds. You know, all of that is really sort of like grief and dealing and adjusting and having gone through a massive health event. A lot of that impacts our health, our mental health, sorry. So what we're talking about today is important, but it's also personally important to you. And I wanted to hit on that before we moved forward. And even if it weren't personally important to you, as a part of the leadership global group, you know, look around you, it's nothing but 1s in the chat, right? So if we are all connected to each other and we are all invested in each other's well-being, then, you know, if I know that your family member is suffering, then I am observant and empathetic to that suffering too, as we should be. So just want to remind you of that first. All right, so we know that it's BIPOC Mental Health Month. Who knows who this is? I don't know if you all can raise your hands, but if you raise them and you're on camera, I'll see. But any guesses as to who this is? All right, I'll just, oh, Denise, do you want to? All right, so this is B.B. Moore Campbell, and actually this month is, or was originally named B.B. Moore Campbell Minority Mental Health Month. And it is named for her because she is an African-American author, advocate, a co-founder of NAMI Urban Los Angeles, a spokesperson who advocated for mental health education, both for herself, but for also the Black community and for her daughter specifically. She struggled to support her daughter who was fighting through mental illness and, you know, getting her daughter help in a system that was not really create it to be easily navigable and a way to get help that was effective and accessible. So she did a lot of advocacy work, and she died in 2006 at the age of 56. And 2 years later, in 2008, Congress formally recognized the month of July as B.B. Moore Campbell National Minority Mental Health Awareness Month to honor her work and her service, and to also bring light to all of these issues of mental illness, especially in minoritized communities, that we will talk about. But as I said in a LinkedIn post earlier this week, BIPOC mental health doesn't really exist. And it was sort of like a cheeky sort of thing. But does anyone want to guess why? And if you don't want to guess, it's fine, I'll tell you. All right, so BIPOC mental health doesn't actually exist because BIPOC is an incredibly vague and incredibly expansive term. There's no such thing as BIPOC mental health because that lumps up altogether those groups that I named in the beginning, several other mental health groups. The month was named Minority Mental Health Month, so a little bit it was inclusive of like the LGBTQ plus community and people with disabilities, right? That are other societal minorities, but not, demographic in the way that we think about race, right? So if we're talking about racialized populations, that's one thing. But if we're talking about, minorities, that's a different thing. And even within those racialized populations, lumping them all together doesn't really work, right? Like everyone has different experiences. There are different statistics about, even the Asian, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander group itself is just a lumping together of lots of different groups with a lot of different experiences who live in different geographical areas and have different issues of access and different ways in which mental health and mental illness comes up. So lumping them together doesn't really work, and there is no one mental health experience for, the BIPOC group. Really, what it means in a lot of circles is non-white, and we have to sort of question why we're using that as a grouping together, because so many different people have different experiences. So this is just this is a quote from a really good article about what it is, what does BIPOC mean, and maybe we should use that term. There are lots of people who have written about this, so just wanted to bring that to mind first. And also say that, I personally, as a researcher, am only so qualified to speak about the BIPOC experience too, because I move through the world as a Black woman, so I know what that is and I know what that feels like. A lot of the work that I have done and research I have read relates to health disparities for Black people in the United States, right? So I don't necessarily know too much about, Black people in the UK and what their mental health experience is like, right? So we all have to understand our limitations and try to work within those, because the more specific we are, the better, and the more we can actually sort of achieve our goals. Let's see if there's anything else that I wanted to cover about that. No. All right. So what are our goals? What do we want to achieve? Right? When we're talking like this, when we're trying to solve problems, especially these big problems of like healthcare outcomes, mental health and illness in the population, we have to really think, what are our goals? And this is something that I do both personally and professionally. I think a lot about impact, right? Like, what is going to be the impact of this action we take? What is going to be the outcome? And what do we want to happen, right? So if our goals are to talk about racialized populations, we should talk about racialized populations. And if our goals are to figure out, what we can be doing better for everyone and creating a more inclusive world, well, that's a really big goal. And it also helps us and behooves us to be more specific too in that case, because we want to do something that is actually manageable and doable while we're doing that work. All right, so all right, how many of you have ever heard the name Anansi? Put a 1 in the chat box. We're shifting gears just a little bit, but we'll come back. Don't worry.
I see no comments in the chat box.
No comments in the
Oh,
chat box.
Erin
Oh,
is our
there's
one.
one. I'll
Our
take it.
1-1.
Yeah, I'll take it. Awesome. All right. So Anansi is the name of my company that I launched to do just this. So I talked about being specific. So for my work specifically, it's still pretty expansive to talk about Black mental health, right? So I have been focusing on Black mental health research and strategy because what I've noticed as in my background as a researcher and as a person who looks into health and health inequalities and data and evidence-based solutions, right? There is not a lot of research specific to what exactly works for Black folks undergoing mental health crises, how best to serve the Black community in the fields of mental health, and how to get more practitioners, mental health practitioners, so psychologists, psychiatrists, other mental health nurse practitioners, get more Black folks into these fields and also tailor these fields so that there's anti-racist practice that results in better health outcomes. Because we know, unfortunately, there are a lot of race-based health outcomes, right? Like the Black maternal health crisis is also a Black maternal mental health crisis. Like there are about half of Black moms are expected to have or suffer with postpartum depression or anxiety or what's called a PMAD, a postpartum maternal mental health disorder of some kind, right? There are different survival rates for surgery. There are different survival rates for cancer. There are different survival rates. There are different rates of actually getting access to care, right? And so I personally and my company can't serve everyone, would love to. And we do work in a lot of different areas. But I also find that the Black community overlaps with a lot of communities that I care about and have seen, poor health outcomes research for. So for like LGBTQ people who go into a practice and are misgendered or are treated a certain way, right? Like there are Black people in the LGBTQ community. We can work on that. For folks with disabilities, actually, a lot of Black people are more likely to have different kinds of disabilities. So we focus on that. So it's just a way of limiting that makes it more targeted and makes me and the work that I do more effective. And I've actually come across a lot of other researchers and companies who focus on just LGBTQ or just the Asian population and I think that is really, really going to be the way that we solve all these problems is that we get a lot of really specialized subject matter experts and we work together in these really effective coalitions and we're all really targeted. And what I do is research, I call it research strategy. And so it's making sure that the research you do is one, actually appropriate, right? Two, targeted and specific and goal and impact driven. That's a lot together, but basically, don't do research for research's sake. Do it because it's actually going to result in policy change of some kind, or it's actually going to result in, improving a program that creates a pipeline for new practitioners, or because it creates a toolkit that is then distributed in schools to the kids who need it. Don't just do it for fun, even though I love research and I would do it all the time, right? We can't just do it for fun. We have to do it in a way that is targeted towards solutions and impact. And also that the way that you present your data and your results and all the interesting things that you found out, that there's a story there, right? Like an actual storytelling experience gets through, I can tell you to just about anyone, but specifically to policymakers, to the people in charge of actually, doing the work of laws and, financing initiatives. Storytelling is the way to do it. And that goes in the policy insights too. So Anansi is a god of stories in a con myth. And he's this spider god who goes up against these other huge animals and wins through being clever and through being smart and through being strategic. So that is how I named my company, small but mighty, and focusing more on being smarter than bigger, right? Because we don't have a lot of resources right now detailed to mental health in our society, unfortunately. But we're going to get them, and this is how. So that is what I do. All right. So now that we're being very, very specific, how to actually improve mental health for marginalized communities. Like I said, we need to be specific. We need to bring these subject matter experts to the fore and get them working together. We need high quality data. There is not a lot of data out there. When I started my business and I started trying to do monthly newsletters of like research-based practices, so I can tell you as maybe a Black mom, what works to keep your stress levels down so you and your kids are fine. There are like no peer-reviewed articles on that. There's nothing. So we have to start getting the data. We have to start doing the targeted studies and get high quality data too, not, what I lovingly call garbage data. So we need to think differently, right? We can't just do studies because they're going to be funded. We have to talk to the funders about why they need to fund this particular study, right? Because we have a lot of information. We have a lot of articles and things that have been published. We have very few things that are actionable and targeted enough to create solutions for people. And with the new generation of folks who are very young and have gone through the COVID pandemic, with all of the sort of financial and economic upturn that we have experienced recently, there are a lot of stressors. There is a lot of grief. There is a lot going on. And we are going to need to think differently about how to get solutions to people that are effective and to continue doing that. All right, so we have another activity here. I'm going to go through these. This is actually in 2 slides. It's broken up just so you can see more easily. But give yourself sort of a couple points in your head, add them up. They'll add up to 6 if you say yes to all of the questions, but just sort of think to yourself, right? Question 1, if you say yes, give yourself 1 point. Excuse me. Do you know exactly how you would go about getting a therapist if you needed one? Yes or no? Do you have a mental health emergency plan? Yes or no? Can you recognize when a friend or family member is in or approaching a mental health emergency? Give yourself 1 point if the answer is yes. Does your workplace have an explicit policy in place around mental health days? Does your workplace have benefits and resources specific to mental health that you could name or would be prepared to use right now if you needed? So not just having them, but what they are. And right now, if you needed them, you could just go use them. And then do you like, or do you actually feel safe talking about mental health, mental illness related topics, anxiety, therapy, things like that? All right. Does anyone have 6 points? If you have 6 points, let me know in the chat, or if you're on screen, nod. Any 6s? Susan, any 6s in there?
I don't see any 6s. I see 2. I see that Jennifer had said yes to 3 things, but after that, no additional comments. Jennifer had 5. Margaret has 4. Elise 3. Emmanuel 2. Mary Beth 3. 5 for Denise. So 5 seems to be as close to the totality as we got. Yes.
Thank you.
Jill has her hand up for a question.
Yeah. Okay. Kudos to everybody that had all those points. I did not.
Yeah.
But I do have a question to the last question that you asked in terms of
I'll go back.
Are we comfortable discussing mental health?
Yeah.
So it's interesting. So the question is, do you like talking about it, right?
Yeah.
So I'm not going to say I like talking about it, but I will share that I'm so much more comfortable talking about it now than I used to be. And I think that that's proof that we understand that it's real.
Yeah.
And the value of not judging, I think is so much, I mean, and in the Black community, right? In the Black community,
Yeah.
from my experience, it used to be, you do not talk about that. We do not have problems. You just need to pray about it.
Yeah.
And so I personally feel like I'm so much more comfortable talking about it. And I'm curious if you see that trend or what you might see with the ability to be comfortable at least talking about it.
Yeah, so I have seen that trend, and I actually really like this question a lot. I mean, I put it there. I, obviously, like the presentation, but but I like this question a lot because it is, something that is sort of new, right? Like not only are we not necessarily comfortable talking about it, to get from just not being uncomfortable to like liking it and integrating into our daily lives and being, active about protecting and taking care of our mental health. Like, what does that look like? Is a place we have to go, right? It's a growth area for just about everyone. I can tell you personally, I am not super comfortable talking about it all the time, but I'm way more comfortable than I used to be in a similar vein, Michelle. And I think that has been the experience across the board. Especially when mental health was sort of having its flashpoint moment mid-pandemic, and everyone was actually talking about this and how terrible this isolation was for our mental health, and not going to school and not getting to do these sort of lifetime milestone events that a lot of kids didn't have a graduation, or they didn't get to go to prom, or, having to deal with grief of seeing family members either sick or actually dying and not being able to get there physically, is something that, people in our society experienced before. All of this was always happening. There were people who were missing their graduation for personal reasons. But it's just that so many people were experiencing together that we were actually able to have the conversation of, wow, this is really doing terrible things to our minds. This is doing terrible things to our spirits. Let's talk about, what we can do for mental health, because this is going to be, I mean, it's not just now, right? It's something that continues to impact you throughout your life. And it's also really interesting that a lot of the people who are having these conversations are sort of this generation that both has living parents and may have kids. So they are having those conversations amongst each other, but they're also having them with their parents, and they're having them with their children in a way that is really great and really effective for like improving everyone's mental health and mental health practice and well-being. Because, we have the generations that came before us that were more worried about just survival, right? Like actually being able to live, and didn't really have even the mental space to think about like, wow, I should go see a therapist, or let alone the money to go do it, or the time, right? And then we have kids growing up with parents who are now doing mindfulness and meditation with them, which is amazing. And we have like all of these kids books about like taking deep breaths and slowing down, and like, your mental health is important, and having big feelings is okay, in a way that a lot of us didn't really have growing up, but it's nice, right? So this is something that is changing now. And I would argue, our goal, our reach goal maybe, but our goal should really be to get to the point where we are not just not uncomfortable, but also we kind of like talking about it, right? Like people like talking about, I made a note on this. Oh, I love talking with people about like smoothie recipes, right? And that's like healthy living, right? Like, oh, how do you make a smoothie? How do you do this? But I don't really have conversations about like, oh my God, I found this therapist and she's the coolest. And this is like, this, resource is the best. And like, we should share it. And, I do that more now because I do it professionally. And so I bring it to my personal life as well. But I would love to live in a world where everyone is actively protecting their mental health, and also, has access to resources, just because we're talking about it all the time, right? If you want it to go, let's talk about a physical health thing. Oh, if you needed like vitamin C or something, I'm sure like a friend of yours would recommend a brand, right? So we need to get to that point where we're like,
Right.
everybody has, something to put in their toolkit, or also to share with you for your toolkit, because the goal is really to create mental health toolkits for ourselves, and practice regularly so that when a crisis comes out, we know exactly what to go to, right? What works.
Mhm. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. Any other comments, thoughts?
Can we go
Folks
through a
have
couple
something?
questions, Susan?
Uh, I I know that you has to me. Yes, if I could only talk. Uh, Michelle had asked, where would you begin to post and share? So you were talking about when you were doing research,
Oh,
it was
yeah.
very difficult to find information that was helpful.
Mhm.
What would you recommend for any of our group that maybe has some information they could help and share with others? What's the best place for them to do that?
Yeah, I would say everywhere, right? So share it, just talk to people about it. Friends and family are probably like the easiest folks to like practice on, right? Like, tell your mom, call your mom and say, hey, I found this cool thing today about, mental health. Do it on social media. I love seeing things that people have posted on LinkedIn, or I'm really on LinkedIn like all the time. So if anyone wants to find me after this, that's where I'll be. Post on LinkedIn. You can post on what are people using these days, like Instagram. I just joined Spill. People are posting on Spill. Threads, I don't know if people are actually using Threads. I actually saw a really funny thing about like their engagement tanked like the first 1 or 2 days. It was like the bright shiny new thing people are using, and then it went like this. But if you are actually using it, anywhere where you're interacting with people, share that information, because you never know who's actually seeing it. I think it's like the 5% rule or something on social media. Like 95% of people are lurkers, only 5% will actually like engage with your content. So there are people who like talk with you and leave comments and whatever, and there are people who just see it. And that's all. But you've still made an impact if they're seeing something that's useful and can be helpful to them in their day to day. So I would say definitely social media. Also, in social settings at work with friends, share everywhere, share as widely as possible, share multiple times, because someone might not see it Monday but would see it Thursday, so that we can all benefit. Uh, because like we said at the beginning, right? Like this is important for all of us because it's important for people we know. And mental health is very real and has a very significant impact on what you can do, in your work life, in your personal life. Your physical health is impacted by mental health. As a person who researches this, I can send you buku studies that show it impacts your physical health too. So yeah, share widely, share everywhere.
Thank you. And Denise, you've got your hand up, and I know
Yeah.
you had put in the chat. What are some of the differences seen between groups that should be highlighted?
Oh, yeah. So that's a really good question. So I would say that I don't know the research for this in the Latin community, but I know in the Black and Asian communities, one of the interesting differences is that mental health conditions show up physically as like GI issues, so stomach issues, and aches and pains, and that those kinds of things, especially for Black folks, are missed when they go in to see a psychologist or psychiatrist, or to see their primary care physician, and maybe the physician does a depression screen. Some of them do, some of them don't. But if you don't meet those criteria, but also have some other criteria, it's been shown that diagnoses like depression get missed in Black women specifically because it shows up differently. And so there are new scales that are better at catching it, but they're not necessarily being used everywhere. So you end up in this game of luck. Like maybe you have a physician who knows these things and can actually help, or maybe you don't, right? And then you don't get care. There are also issues with currently standing diagnostic tools, like there's one for schizophrenia. Oh, well, not for schizophrenia, for depression. And Black people get diagnosed with schizophrenia instead of depression in a lot of areas. And I don't know what's being done to actually fix that, but I know that it's a problem, right? Like a lot of the things that we have are like, we know this is an issue, and then there's, we have to figure out how to fix it. So that's some of the data. If if there is something specific that you are looking for, I would love to dig into it. Definitely contact me after this. But that's just some of the things that have shown up.
And Denise, I think you have another question. You had raised your hand earlier.
Yeah, so I love what you're presenting and the content and all that's here. There's I was the one that asked about the differences in groups, and I think it's important because if we're not careful, DEI and minority, BIPOC, it kind of narrows the our visual cortex and whatnot. And there's so many other kinds of people who are marginalized that we, and so my bigger question is this: we know that there are not enough therapist practitioners in general. And it appears to me, outside looking in, granted, that there's not a whole lot of training or education in that group to help expand their thinking to be able to take on more or help other individuals who may not present in the way the writing has traditionally been shown. What's going on that's helping the therapists to be better at screening and diagnosing and assisting or referring people to the right kind of person to help them? Because as you know, well, I don't know if you practice or not, but as a coach, I know that I have to be very careful as to who I refer people to because of the fact that the first point is, no matter how we say mental health is not something to be ashamed of, we live in a culture around the world that says, we're supposed to be strong, pull ourselves up by the bootstraps, you can do it. And so it doesn't really matter. The messages, whoever they are, and particularly people who have hidden disabilities or disabilities of some sort, they're always being ostracized as not good enough. So what are we doing in the therapy world and even in EAPs to help those therapists figure out a better way of dealing with this? Because they have the skills, they just I don't know that they have the knowledge, is my experience.
Yeah. So there are a couple of organizations that are working on trainings and things sort of around this, and now I can think of two off the top of my head. Taraji Henson's Boris Henson. I don't know the whole name. I can never remember the whole name. But it's named for her dad, and that foundation actually has training for therapists to get them more culturally competent for specific communities. And then I believe BEAM, the Black Emotional and Mental Wellbeing Organization, also does trainings for practitioners and additional trainings for just regular schmegular people who are going through mental health challenges or who are interested in mental health and what they can put in their toolkits to take care of themselves and others. There's also, and this has been going on for a while, mental health first aid has really brought a really good resource to people in training them the way that you would train for like physical first aid, right? And I took a mental health first aid course specific to veterans in 2016, I want to say, maybe 2015. So they've been going for a while, but they train people, just regular people, to recognize. Here, the previous question I had said, when a friend or family member is approaching a mental health emergency, and they also have specific trainings for like the workplace, like how do you know if like a coworker might need some support or something like that. And then one of the other pieces that you talked about that I really want to touch on is that it's not just that mental health is seen as a liability, right? It is actually, well, not mental health, mental illness, right, is actually a liability in a lot of places, right? People will fire you, unfortunately, or will not give you as many hours, or will not support you in the way that you need to be supported, even though it's not legal for them to do it because it's a health condition, it's still happening in a lot of places that is an actual liability. So there's this idea, right, that like, oh, now we live in a safe society and you can talk about it. We're getting there. I would love for us to get there. But that idea that you can't actually talk about it in certain spaces because of what will happen is very real. And I think that sometimes people are a little bit gaslit, like, oh, no, don't worry about it. Everything's safe here. And then if something happens and you're like, well, I was open in the way that people told me to be open. And now I feel even less safe than I did previously. So just recognizing that, unfortunately, we're not there yet where everywhere is safe. But in therapy, it should be safe, right? And it should be something that you can actually actively work on without having, financial, economic liabilities. But that's another goal for us, is to actually get to the point where people understand and believe that people who are suffering mental health challenges can be effective at work and are fine, and can actually get stuff done and can actually be assets. One of my favorite people I follow is Natasha Bowman. I don't know if any of you have heard of her, but she has bipolar, and she was telling a story about her daughter in school. And they were talking about bipolar disorder and like, oh, people will never be productive and they'll never be able to hold down a job. And her daughter raises her hand and says, my mom is bipolar and she works, right? Like she goes to work just like everybody else. Like she comes home, we have dinner. Like it's
I don't want to interrupt you, Chantell.
Yeah.
But I don't know how many more pages you have of the deck that you wanted to present, because we really are interested in this subject, clearly.
Yeah.
So, and then I know there's some other messages in chat, but just kind of letting you know about the time, because we have about 15 more minutes. So,
all right.
So if you want to, just want to give you a heads up.
So wrap up now for now, but obviously, lots of good stuff to talk about here, and do not be afraid to reach out to me after this. I like talking about this stuff and I like moving us all forward. All right, so I actually don't know how many slides I have left either. I don't think there are very many. So
okay.
So mental health equity is the goal, right? So having 6 points, we would live in a world where we had mental health equity, right? Like everyone would have what they need to lead mentally healthy lives, physically healthy too. That's not our focus for today, but would be a nice state to be in. But what this means is exactly what we just talked about, right? So no matter who you are, what demographics you fall into, if you had any challenges you faced in your day-to-day life, we would live in a society that set you up for success, that set you up to take care of that, right? So that means in our personal lives, in our careers, and our relationships with each other, we should aim to create spaces, policies, and procedures that work for and not against mental health. So the what here is mental health equity. And it's a lot easier to make the journey to the what when we know what it is. So that was my purpose of asking you those questions. Some of you are pretty close, a lot of 5s in there. But I personally, and know a lot of people who would score, 1, 2, and that's not anything to be ashamed of. It's just not the things that we think about in our day-to-day life, and it doesn't really set us up for success. All right, so that's the what, how we get there, right? So before we move the needle, we have to see why this is important, have conversations with people that result in their ability to see why it's important every day, important all the time, and important enough for the second thing, which is resource allocation, right? We need to invest funding, not just in actual mental health care and services like therapists, like we talked about. We don't have enough therapists. We don't have enough therapists for anyone, let alone for people of color, let alone for LGBTQ people. A lot of therapists are not able to service disabled populations. Like how many people here know a therapist who knows ASL and practices in ASL, right? Like there are some, but what if you were somewhere where you can't find one and you're a member of the deaf or hard of hearing community, right? So we really need resource allocation to not just that, but also in public health supports and in public health funding, because housing is connected to mental health, safe housing. I published a chapter on this when I was in graduate school on, crowded housing and mental health suffering. Having a healthy and safe neighborhood where you feel like you can go out and exercise is connected to mental health. There are actually studies that show that just that access to nature, there was one in the Cleveland Clinic, that recovery in the hospital was better with people who could see trees out of their window or were actually able to go out into nature, right? Like your physical and mental health are connected. Your ability to get out and see trees and touch grass, right, is really important for your mental health. So socioeconomic status, not just having the money, but having the time to actually care for yourself and your family. Things like having parental leave, paid maternal leave is tied to better outcomes for moms, for postpartum depression, for anxiety, for all of it. Like if you don't have to worry about money as much, you're less likely to get postpartum depression. And postpartum depression is a huge, huge, huge morbidity for our society right now, and specifically for Black moms, but all moms too. So resource allocation and strategy. Let's see, right? We need to think about data. We need data. We don't have enough. And there are huge gaps in what we know. And the available research, if you look at it, a lot of it is dated. Even the good research we have is from 5-10 years ago. And we really need updated studies, especially having undergone this huge mental health event that was the pandemic. All right, so I talked about the data that we need. There is a full spectrum of data needs, and this is some of the stuff that I work with people on. Incidence rates, prevalence, access to care, clinical practice, and outcomes. We have gaps in data for all of that, not just for Black folks, but for the Asian community, which also, like I talked about, is not a monolith at all, right? For LGBTQ populations, barriers to care and how patients successfully navigate barriers is something that we really need some information on, because some people do, sort of make it all the way through or find a therapist that works. We also know a lot of people find a therapist and start therapy, and then there's a drop off for people who don't go back. Right, like they have therapy once, they have a session, or they meet a new therapist and they don't click, and then they don't go back. Figuring out a way to get people back into healthcare after they have had a bad experience is an area that we really need data on. And then I think this is one of my last slides. So what can you actually do? What can you do? So you can be empathetic, right? Like we talked about, and you can talk to people about why this is important and why it's important to you, right? Like even if you're a person who does not suffer from a mental health condition or does not have family members who do, you probably have friends who do. You probably have coworkers who do. A lot of people, like we talked about, are not disclosing about this for very real reasons or for, just generally not feeling safe. So creating a world in which we are comfortable talking about this and in which there are not any costs for talking about this should be the goal. Invest resources. If you are, a person who has some disposable income and wants to give Beam money every month, I always say donate to Beam. They do amazing work. There are organizations and foundations who do this all the time and are very good at it. There are also people like me who work on it. And if you want to work on a study, I want to help you do that in a way that is effective and impactful. Talk to me about it. I'm happy to take on more clients, customers, partners, people who will help get this work done. Share and discuss. I think we talked about already, right? Like do it on social media, do it in your personal life. talk to people. And especially if you find a toolkit or a resource that is particularly good for you, if we have more tools like that and we get a mass of people using them, then we can do a study and show how effective it is and get, statistically reliable data that can be published. And then that can be a resource for others, right? Like the lack of peer-reviewed data on this is something that we can do. We can tackle that problem. Get active. That's a little bit in the same vein, but also active in terms of your own mental health, like practice regularly, create your toolkit, do all that good stuff, and keep learning, of course, in rooms like this one, our virtual room, and everywhere else. All right, so summary, and we've got 10 minutes, so this is perfect. We can do some Q&A. So we need to believe another world is possible, right? Where mental health equity is achievable. We know what it is, so we know where we're going. And we need to move towards that goal by investing in intentional and specific data collection, strategic research, and policy change. We need to bring this to our policy leaders and get things funded and get things changed so that we have more access to the things that are important and impactful. All right, so thank you for your time, interest, energy, and action. Let's go do some work and some research that matters. And then I'll leave this up here. This is my email address, or you can connect with me on LinkedIn. You can sign up for the Anansi newsletter, which is really easy to remember. It's just signup.anansi.com. You can go there, or you can email me to get on my calendar and we can talk more.